As helicopters become more common and their uses more varied, it's important to know that these machines are also better built, safer to fly, and the pilots are better trained than ever before. For the passenger inside, a flight in a helicopter is much like a flight in any other aircraft. But of course, because passengers often enter and exit helicopters while the machines are running, the safety considerations are often quite different. Even though you may have ridden in a helicopter before, spend a few minutes with us on some key points of safety for helicopter passengers. We'll review proper entry and exit procedures, how to safely store equipment on board, ground safety around the landing and takeoff area, proper use of seat belts and the intercom, and what to do in the event of an emergency. This information will help to make your flight safe and enjoyable. Your pilot is also an important source of information. A pre-flight briefing is mandatory. Listen carefully to what your pilot tells you.
Which of course is very dangerous. It could get sucked into the rotors or the engine as well.
Passengers who are directing the pilot to perform a specific task or to land in a certain area should keep in mind that it generally takes 2 hands to fly a helicopter. Don't expect the pilot to point to things, and don't ask questions that will require the pilot to use hand gestures. The very reasons a helicopter flies and moves, the main rotor and the tail rotor, are the most important safety considerations when entering or leaving a machine. A simple rule of thumb to avoid the tail rotor is always stay within the pilot's field of vision. That's the area from the doors forward. Keep well forward and away from the dangerous tail rotor, which all but disappears when it's spinning. When boarding, wait for the pilot's signal to approach the aircraft and walk around the front of the helicopter to get to the other side. Never duck under the tail boom. It should also be remembered that the main rotor blades can sag or droop, often due to a gust of wind, and you must duck or crouch slightly while approaching or leaving the helicopter. Keep your eye on where you're heading, not on the ground. If the ground is uneven, always approach and leave the helicopter on the downslope side. For the same reason, equipment or other gear carried near the helicopter should always be held at or below waist level, so it remains well below the main rotor. Never carry equipment, skis, or anything else on your shoulder. And don't wave. Gear should be stored carefully so it can't shift during flight, and when unloading, don't throw material off the aircraft. It could get thrown into the rotor. Inside the cabin of the helicopter, nothing must block the doors. Door latches on helicopters don't automatically lock. You must ensure they are properly closed. Normally, the pilot will direct loading, unloading, and closing of doors. But remember, you have the right to ask, and the pilot has the responsibility to show you these procedures. Hats and loose articles of clothing should be held firmly when entering and exiting a helicopter. Or if your hands are occupied, they should be strapped down. Bring along footwear that's appropriate for the task at hand. Wear warm enough clothing to cope with any weather, and take along essential medication in case of delays. It's also important to avoid touching the helicopter's antenna and glass bubble while moving around outside the machine, and to avoid touching switches and controls inside the cabin. Helicopter seat belts are the same design as those in other aircraft. Make sure yours is fastened securely and snugly, and don't remove it until the pilot signals that it's all right to do so. If shoulder harnesses are available, use them. It's also wise to fasten all seat belts, even those not actually in use, to prevent them from hanging out the door and damaging the aircraft. The noise generated by a helicopter makes communication difficult. Normally, an intercom is used to speak to the pilot and other passengers. Most intercoms require passengers to push a button to talk. It's important to limit conversation to matters concerning the flight and never speak to the pilot during takeoff and landing, unless it's to warn of an emergency. The pilot must concentrate on flying the machine at these critical times and may be communicating with air traffic control personnel. Chatter on the intercom can be distracting and may result in a missed instruction from the controllers. And when the pilot is speaking, he can't hear the passengers anyway. So wait until you're into the flight before talking. When you're around a helicopter landing pad, note the wind direction. Like other aircraft, helicopters approach into the wind. Knowing the wind direction will allow you to position yourself safely as helicopters take off and land. The wind generated by the helicopter's main rotor is known as downwash, or simply wash. The larger the helicopter, the greater the wash. So it's important to keep landing areas clear of items that might be blown around by the downwash. There are two reasons. The flying debris can cause injury to those on the ground, and it could be blown into the blades or sucked into the turbines of the helicopter. The force of the wind generated by a helicopter landing or taking off can also slam shut nearby doors and windows. Be aware of anything near the helipad that's light enough to be moved by the wash and secure it, whether it's a piece of plywood or an innocent-looking plastic garbage bag. Loose plastic is deadly to the safe operation of a helicopter. Helicopters are reliable and safe machines, but occasionally, mechanical problems could force an emergency landing. Similarly, poor weather or other circumstances may require the pilot to land the machine as a precaution. Of course, you can and should ask the pilot to point out the location of the following equipment. First, note where emergency equipment, first aid kit, and fire extinguishers are located. Note the exit doors and how to operate them. Also learn where the emergency locator transmitter is, as well as the life raft if one is on board. The pilot can show you, or you'll find it on your cabin safety card. A few seconds spent on these matters now may save your life in the event of an emergency landing. Despite its appearance, a helicopter can be very stable and controllable during emergency landings. If the engines were to fail on a helicopter while the machine is airborne, the pilot still has a great deal of control through a process called auto-rotation. As the helicopter descends, the air rushing upwards spins the rotor blades, just the same as if the engine were still working. Thus, the pilot can still control the helicopter and land it safely, even without engine power. So an emergency landing is often a very safe landing. Still, in an emergency situation, listen carefully to the pilot's instructions. Tighten your seatbelt, remove your necktie, and loosen your collar. Also remove eyeglasses and put them in your pocket. If you're using only a lap belt, assume the brace position when told to by the pilot and wait for his or her okay before leaving the craft. If you're strapped in with a shoulder harness, sit up straight in the seat with the harness pulled snug. Keep your knees together and fold your arms across your chest. After landing, wait for all movement to stop before exiting. And don't panic. Help is already on the way. If you'll be flying over water, know where the life raft is stored, but wait until you're well clear of the downed craft before inflating it. To help rescue personnel to find you, try to remember to take the emergency locator transmitter along. The ELT sends out a homing signal for emergency response teams. Know where it's stored before the helicopter takes off. You can help yourself avoid emergency situations by realizing that the pilot always has the final say on whether to fly. It is the pilot's responsibility to assess weather conditions, weight, and other concerns. Helicopters perform many specialized functions. However, unless you're trained to work on these specialized flights, you won't be allowed to go along. You would only be exposing yourself to unnecessary danger. During procedures like prescribed burning, aerial fertilization, and helicopter logging, the pilot is even busier than normal and wouldn't have time to instruct or supervise untrained personnel. Be selfish about your safety and reduce your own risk. Don't go along for the ride on working flights unless you have an actual job to perform. Now let's review the safety points covered so far. Your pilot is the final authority on safety procedures while you're in or around a helicopter. If you have questions about safety, ask.
there to make sure it's...
When approaching or departing a helicopter, always crouch slightly to stay well below the main rotor. Stay around the front of the aircraft. Never walk to the rear of a helicopter. Hold equipment and other gear at or below waist level and ensure it's properly loaded and secured. Clear the landing and takeoff area of all loose debris. Inside the cabin, do not place anything in front of the doors. Keep chatter on the intercom to a minimum. Pull your seatbelt snug during the flight and use the shoulder belts when they're available. Note the location of all emergency equipment before you leave the ground, and be sure to take adequate clothing and any essential medication in case the return trip is delayed. This completes the review of basic helicopter safety procedures. Now, let's look at more specialized helicopter flights.